Hello friends, welcome to today's discussion on performance of contract, or rather should I say a continuation aspect of performance of contract. Let us see some more important technical areas under performance of contract. The first of the discussion will be about the differences or distinction between succession and assignment. Well, for a normal layman scenario, succession means basically inheritance, and for assignment basically means passing on of the benefit to a third person. Let us see further, because of the technical languages involved in this provisions, it might sound a little tricky for you, but I will try and make it as simple as possible. Distinction between succession versus and assignment. First one. When benefits of a contract are succeeded by the process of law, example, on the legal heirs, then the burden of that particular property and the benefits of that particular property in the contract can devolve on them, that is on the legal heirs. Classic example, if I have given here, if the son inherits property of the father after the death of the father, then son is liable to pay the debts or liabilities owned by the father during his lifetime. That means on passing on, or rather once the father deceases, his property passes on to the son. Let's say that property had loan against it. So it becomes the liability of the son to clear the loan and then take the custody of the property. Just because father has passed away, only property cannot come, and son cannot say, I will not pay the loan part of it, that is father's problem. No, that is not the intention of law. The burden and benefits both passes on to the son in this case. Therefore, son has to pay the liability of the father or debt of the father related to the particular property. However, point to be noted here is, but the son can only be liable to the extent of property inherited from the father and not on the excess debts. Say on the same property, if the father has raised loans from 3-4 people and the total of the loans is about, let's say, 2 crores and the value of the property, let's say, is about 1.5 crores, maximum that the son is liable is to the extent of 1.5 crores and not for the excess 50 lakhs, which is fairly reasonable and logical also. I hope you got the point on succession. Let's move on to the next aspect, that is assignment. Here, little trickiness gets involved because of the usage of the word debtor, creditor. I will try and make it as simple as possible to you. Please concentrate on this part. If a contract of assignment, in a contract of assignment, only the benefits from the contract can be assigned or transferred, but not the liability. In this case, this is because a third party gets involved here. Therefore, a debtor can relieve himself of his liability to the creditor by assigning it to someone, his obligation to repay the debt. So what do I mean by here? In this situation, let's say you have, I would possibly give a simplest possible example for you to understand. Let's say Airtel is the mobile connection that you have. Let's say it's a postpaid connection, and a monthly billing of, let's say, 1,000 rupees happens, assuming it is including GST. Now, if Airtel decides to assign the rights of receivable, the money gets, which is supposed to be received by Airtel month on month, if it's, let's say, assigns this right or transfers this right to receive this monthly 1,000 rupees to another entity, let's say Canfin Financial Services, who basically takes over these receivables, pays let's say 95% of the total receivables to Airtel, then we say Airtel has assigned the rights of receivable to Canfin Services. It can be two types, where sans recourse, that is without recourse, or with recourse. Without recourse means if there is a default by the ultimate customer to pay the 1,000 rupees, Canfin Financial Services will have to bear the loss and not Airtel. Having said that, if it is with recourse, then to the extent possible, Canfin Financial Services will collect the money from the customers, and to the extent of default, Airtel has to make good the default. That is why I have used the word debtor, creditor And in simple words, you can understand that whenever I have to collect the money from someone, in my books it is debtors, and in their books it is creditors. So as long as I can trade with my receivables, then I can collect the money from a third party with this fact called sans recourse or without recourse versus with recourse transaction. If it is without recourse, then the person who is collecting the money from the ultimate customer is kind of protected enough, because the primary person who has assigned this right to another entity, if there is a default from the customer, the primary entity is still liable for it. Therefore, the usage of data creditor could be a little confusing. For you, in simple words, basically a receivable has been transferred, assigned to someone, and such a receivable is collected by someone by trading it with the primary person for an XYZ amount. Generally, it works out to be around 90% of the receivable. 10% becomes the margin for those who are involved in these collection as collection agents. So, are you clear about that, my dear friends, as far as the example is concerned? Assuming so, in case you still have a doubt, please mail me. I will give further more examples relating to this issue. In continuation of it, on the other hand, a creditor, if he assigns the benefit of the promise, the assignee is entitled to realize the debt from the debtor. Note, where the benefit is coupled with liability and or when personal consideration gets involved in a contract, then the benefit cannot be assigned. So the last 2 points basically talks about can I assign a liability? The third point spoke about assigning the right to receive, which is basically an asset. Assignment of liability cannot happen. That means I was supposed to pay someone XYZ amount, and I can't assign this payable to someone else until and unless that someone else agrees to take over my liability. As regards receivable, definitely I can assign my receivables to someone else in a contract of assignment. I can break through the transaction by having a margin which becomes the revenue for the person who is the assignee. Assigner is the person who is giving the contract, who is giving the receivables for the assignee to collect. Now, please keep this in mind, where receivables can be assigned, a liability, a payable cannot be assigned. Having said that, further, if there is a benefit coupled with the liability, if the benefit along with liability, what I expressed in succession, along with it, if there is a personal consideration, or apart from it, if there is a personal consideration, then such contracts cannot be assigned. Can you give an example for it? Yes, sir. Yes, I can definitely give an example. Now, if let's say a father has passed away, son is taken over the property, debt is there, he has to repay the debt, and then if there is any balance, he can take that difference. That is called succession. If there is excess debt over the asset, he is not liable to pay that excess. We know that fact, having covered that in succession. Now, the same example, if I have to extend, the benefit and the liability. The benefit is the property and the liability is the debt. He cannot transfer or assign this to someone else. He himself has to take it. And in case of a personal consideration contract, let's say a contract of art painting, whenever the contract has been entered to, let's say, painting of a modern art or a picture of a celebrity, then only such person who has been painting such cases with personal consideration, with skill involved, with personal skill involved, only such person can sign or can paint it, or rather execute the contract. He cannot assign this contract of painting to someone else because there is personal consideration involved here. So are we clear about these points? Definitely, in my opinion, differentiation or distinction between succession and assignment is an expected question for your exam. So please do prepare, try and research some more examples for succession and assignment. Moving further, the other elements of performance of contract. First is effect of refusal of the party to perform promise. So if there is a refusal of the party to perform the contract, what will happen is what we are trying to understand here. Let us see that. when a party to a contract has refused to perform or disabled himself from performing his promise in entirety, the promisee may put an end to the contract unless he has signified by words, conduct, his acquiescence in continuance, that is reluctance to contract. Technical words agreed, but it is quite simple. Try to understand it in a simple way. I'll break it up for you into small pieces. When a party to a contract has refused to perform, so he is not performing it, or disabled himself from performing his promise, he is doing such an act which conveys that he is not ready to perform it. He is disabling himself, he is not making himself available to perform the contract. Then the promisee, that is the other party, can put an end to the contract. Till here I hope it is very clear. So if the promisor has disabled himself or is not performing the contract, the promisee can put an end to the contract. However, unless he has signified by words or by way of conduct his acquiescence, that is reluctance to continue in its continuance. That means if the promisee has informed the promisor stating that notwithstanding the fact that he is refused to perform, still the promisee is ready and willing to perform, even though under the concept of reluctance, even though if he is reluctant to continue it, if he is conveyed it, then he cannot put an end to the contract, is what I am trying to explain. Well, in the second point it becomes very clear. Please check the second point. Therefore, the aggrieved party, that is the promisee, has two rights. One, either to terminate the contract, that is to end the contract, or to indicate by words or conduct that he is interested in continuance. So, in spite of the promisor not performing the contract or disabling himself to perform the contract, then the promisee gets two rights. One, of course, to end the contract by way of termination, or if he chooses, that is, if the promisee chooses to continue the contract by either the words written or by way of conduct, if he is conveyed his interest to continue the contract, then what happens? Of course, it is his right. Third point is, in case the promisee decides to continue the contract, please observe the second point, the second point here, and in case the promisee decides to continue the contract, he cannot put an end to the contract subsequently. So either he has to put an end to the contract initially itself, or he continues the contract. Whether by words, it should be by words or by conduct, even though if he is reluctant to continue, if the moment he has continued the contract, then definitely later on, that is subsequently, he cannot end the contract. Having said that, however, he can claim damages if he intends to do so. That means when the promisor has failed to perform or disabled himself to perform, the promisee can end the contract, or if he chooses to continue the contract, he can choose to continue the contract by additional point telling that yes, I would like to continue the contract provided you give me my damages for the loss incurred. If that is the case, yes, he can claim damages. Having continued the contract with the clause of claim of damages, he cannot terminate the contract. Are we clear on the points, my dear friends? Fantastic. Next part is the other side of the story, that is effect of refusal to accept the performance. So if somebody is willing to perform, there is refusal to accept such performance. In such scenario, what will happen? Let us see one by one. Where the promisor has made an offer of performance to the promisee, that means the promisor has made an offer, he's tendered his offer, he's attempted to perform the contract, then who has not accepted it, that is the promisee has not accepted it, then the promisor is not responsible for non-performance, but he will not lose the rights under the contract. So the promisor has offered to perform, tendered to perform, for which the acceptance from the promisee has not happened. In such a case, the promisor is not going to be responsible for non-performance. Promisor has done everything what he could have done. The promisee has not accepted it. What best could the promisor do? He's done it. And in spite of that, if the promisee has not accepted it, then henceforth the promisor is not responsible for non-performance. Having said that, he will not lose any of the rights in the contract. He can sue the person, he can claim for damages, he can either cancel the contract or he can claim for special damages depending on what the terms of the contract is. So whatever the rights in the contract which was there, it will continue to be there with the promisor in spite of the fact that the promisee has failed to perform, or rather failed to accept it. Are we clear on this point? Yes. In continuation of it, every such offer must fulfill certain conditions. So to get this benefit, what is the benefit? The promisor will not be henceforth responsible, and having the right of the contracts intact. To get this, the promisor should have done the offer of performance. That means there should have been certain conditions. That condition should be satisfied to get the benefit mentioned in point number 1. Let us see the condition 1. It should be unconditional. So the attempt of performance, the tender of performance basically should be unconditional, which should not have any conditions whatsoever. If it has to be delivered at a certain place, it has to be certain place only. He cannot beat around the bush and telling that if you do this, if you do that. He has to just follow whatever was mentioned in the contract. Only then we can say it is an unconditional tender of performance. Second, it should be made at the proper time and place, and in such circumstances that a reasonable opportunity of ascertaining is given to check if the offer was whole of what he was bound to do. That means whenever the offer is performed by the promisor, he should do it at a proper time and proper place. If proper time and place is given in the contract, he should follow it. Otherwise, it should be a reasonable time, that is basically business hours, and place of business could be one of the choice. Then if he satisfies these things, only then we can say he's attempted the performance in a very true sense of tender of performance. Having said that, please observe this point that a reasonable opportunity of ascertaining what the offer of performance was and whether such offer was in line with what the contract was entered into. That means, let's say 100 bags of rice was brought in. A reasonable opportunity of checking should be given to the promisee whether it was in fact 100 bags, and if it is 100 bags, whether it was in fact rice and not something else. Such a reasonable opportunity should be given. Only then we can say there was a valid tender of performance. In continuation of it, if the offer is to deliver anything to the promisee, then he should be given a reasonable opportunity of seeing to check whether the thing offered to be delivered is in fact what the promisor was bound to do. So basically it has an extension, that is the third point, is an extension of what I just mentioned. You should give, that is the promisor should give a reasonable opportunity to the promisee to check whether the items which was brought or the items which was supposed to be delivered, which is basically a tender of offer of performance, whether it is in line with what the contract was entered into, what the promisor was bound to deliver, whether he is in fact delivering the same, that should be checked by the promisee. Therefore, a reasonable opportunity has to be given by the promisor to the promisee. Only then we can say that the tender of performance is valid. Note, an offer of one of the joint promisees, an offer to one of the joint promisees has the same legal consequences as though it is an offer made to all of them. So, if there are several joint promisees, if you have made an offer to one of the joint promisees, it is as good as you have made an offer to all the joint promisees put together. The same legal effect or same legal consequences what I have mentioned above will hold good even in the case of joint promisees, where you have made an offer or tendered an offer of performance to even a single joint promisee. It's as good as you made an offer to all the promisees in the contract. So that was all about refusal issues. Let's move on to the next aspect called liability of the joint promisor and joint promisee. Liability of joint promisor and joint promisee. Very interesting here. Let's see. If the liability of joint promisors, basically the contract has what obligations that the joint promisors has to perform, then it should be performed by all of the joint promisors, or if any of the joint promisor has passed away, is deceased, then surviving joint promisors along with the legal representatives of the deceased has to perform that obligation. They are liable to perform the obligation or if all of the joint promisors have passed away or deceased, then all the legal representatives of such a deceased joint promisors is liable to perform the promise. Are we clear on this? Simple. A, B, C were joint promisors. All of them should perform. If A dies, his legal representatives along with B and C should perform. If A, B and C, all of them die, then A's legal representative along with B's legal representative along with C's legal representative should perform. That means they are liable to perform the contract. So, I hope you got the point. Next is what if possibilities. Let's see it as what the circumstances revolving around these are as far as the law is concerned. This rule applies when there is nothing contrary in the contract. So, first and foremost, you should see the text of the contract, the wordings of the contract. If there is something against this rule mentioned in point 1, then we say it is contrary to the contract, contrary to the general understanding that joint promisors should perform, or if there is a deceased person, his legal representative along with the remaining joint survivor joint promisors, or if all of them are passed away, then all the legal representatives of such joint promisors have to perform. This is basically the general nature. If there is a clause which states that which is against this or which is contrary to it, then this rule will not apply. For example, if A, B and C are joint promisors, and if there is a clause in the agreement which states in the event of death of any of the joint promisors, their legal representatives shall not be liable to perform, only the survivor joint promisors should perform, then only the survivor joint promisors shall perform. So are we clear on this, my dear friends? Fantastic. Next, what if they do not discharge their respective obligations? That is A, B and C, if they do not discharge their respective obligation, or along with their legal representatives, if they are not performing their obligations, what happens? Then the promisee may ask any one or more of such joint promisors to perform the promise. So if, let's say, A, B and C, A is not performing, then the promisee, that is the other party, can ask either B or B and C to compel them to perform the promise. That is the benefit given under this provision. I hope you got the example right. Next, each promiser may compel the others for the contribution. So at one end, the promisee can compel the one or more of the joint promisers to perform. Having said that, each of the joint promisers can compel for contribution. In my example, if let's say D is the promisee, he can compel B or C or both to perform if A has not performed his share of obligation. As a continuation of it, to perform, B and C both put together can compel A for his share of contribution to perform the contract or to execute the contract related to D. So it's a very clear, circle over there. If you are not obligated, if you are not performing, one end the promisee can force the joint promisers or one of them to perform the contract, and when the contract is getting executed, the so-called non-performer joint promiser can be compelled to perform by the other joint promisers. That's the beauty of law here. So I hope you got the example right here. In continuation of it, if anyone makes default in such contribution, then the remaining joint promisers must bear the loss equally. So, in spite of this, if assuming A fails to perform, let's say he becomes insolvent and is not capable of performing it, then B and C, who are the survivors, who are the remaining joint promisers, have to perform their share of obligation equally. Not their share of obligation, overall share equally should be taken. I will give you an example later for your understanding. In continuation of it, if the above provisions will not apply to surety who has made payments on behalf of the principal, that is, the surety can recover. Let's say there is a contract where joint promisers have to execute a certain promise to the promisee, and as an independent transaction, A in his principal capacity has entered into a transaction which is let's say by Mr. X, who is the surety for this transaction. In such a scenario, if X has paid some payments on behalf of A, definitely this will not affect whatever rules I mentioned. This will not affect the surety. The surety can recover back the money from Mr. A, as it is an independent transaction. Surety cannot be compelled or cannot be brought within this concept of joint promisors. Having said that, the next point is also very similar. Similarly, the principal can also recover from the surety on account of payments made by the principal. So, if by chance the principal has made payments on behalf of surety to someone else, then definitely the principal can recover back such monies from the surety. It has nothing to do with the respective joint obligations of joint promisors. I hope the example was clear enough for you to understand. In case you get doubt, please do rewind the video, watch it slowly, you will understand it in a much better sense. Continuation of it. Intention of all these points is to make the parties of parties to the contract joint and several. So in case of a joint contract, if this joint and several clause which we understood in partnership, if that is not there, then the whole essence can get disturbed, the whole execution can get disturbed. Therefore, the intention of the law appears that if joint and several liability is provided, that is, if one of the parties are not executing it, the remaining parties have to execute, and if they are not capable, their personal assets will come into play to settle the liabilities or to clear the obligations mentioned in the contract. Therefore, joint and several liability clause becomes very critical in such joint contracts. So, are we clear, my dear friends, on these points? Fantastic. Now, if one of the joint promisor is released by the promisee, this is interesting. Let's say A, B and C were the joint promisors, D is the promisee. Promisee D says, A, you are no more liable to clear this or to perform your obligation. Basically, the one of the joint promisors is released by the promisee to perform, then the remaining joint promisors are not released or discharged. So the fact that if the promisee has released one of the joint promisors, in my case, D has released A to perform his obligation, then it does not mean that B and C are also released. They are not discharged. They continue to perform. They have to continue to perform their obligations. That is, the overall contract has to be performed and executed in favor of D, who is the promisee. Now you may ask me a question, what happens to A here? Please check. Further, such a released joint promisor shall continue to be liable to the other joint promisors. So it's a beautiful lock here. D may release A, B and C continue to be liable to D, but A continues to be liable to B and C. I repeat again, D, who is a promisee, may release A, who is one of the joint promisors, from performing his obligation. Then B and C, the remaining joint promisors, have to execute the whole transaction in favor of D. They are liable to perform the entire obligation in favor of D. Having said that, A continues to be liable to perform his share of obligation to B and C, so that the beautiful system of joint contract gets executed. So therefore I say further, such a released joint promisor, which is A here, shall continue to be liable to other joint promisors, that is B and C. Example clear? Hope so. Continuing further, the other side of the story now, that is rights of the joint promisees. What is the right of the joint promisees? Let us see. The right to claim the contract or benefit from the contract is same as what I mentioned for joint promisors. So the promisee, if it is joint promisees, the right to claim the contract or the benefits that is accruing from the contract, who can claim? One, they can claim, all of them can claim, or the surviving promisees along with the legal representatives of the deceased joint promisee, or all the legal representatives of the deceased promisees can claim the rights or benefits out of the contract, provided all the joint promisees have passed away or deceased. So it's same like a joint promisor, it's the other side of the the benefit of the contract can be received by all the joint promisees. In case there is a death, the deceased legal representative along with the remaining surviving joint promisees. If all the joint promisees die, then the legal representatives, all the legal representatives can claim the contract or benefits accruing from the contract. So that was about the respective obligations and liabilities of promisers and rights of the promisees, joint promisees in this case. I have given an example, quickly we will run through it. B and C lent rupees 5 lakhs to A, who promises to pay B and C jointly. So B and C has lent 5 lakh rupees to A. A has told he will perform this promise and repay this money back to B and C jointly along with interest on a specified date. If B dies before the specified date, then right to demand the payment will be with the legal representatives of B along with surviving joint promises of C. Are you understanding? B dies, his legal representative along with the surviving joint promisee who is C can claim the benefit of this 5 lakhs plus interest. That is what I mentioned. A right to demand the payment will be with LR, legal representative of B, and C, who is the surviving joint promisee. What if, in case C also dies, along with B, C also dies, then the rights will be with all the legal representatives, that is, B and C's respective legal representatives will get the right to demand the payment from Mr. A for rupees 5 lakhs along with the interest on the specified date. So I hope this example was very clear enough for you to understand. You can create your own examples which is in line with this to understand the concept better. The best way to explain is by giving examples. So I would suggest you, after going through all these points, make up your own examples which is in line with this so that it becomes easier for you to write the exams. Are we clear on these points, my dear friends? So that was about today's session on performance of contract. My further sessions will discuss some more points on performance of contract in my upcoming videos. Thank you for watching. If you have any doubts, please do mail me your doubts to lloydsacademy@gmail.com. I will revert back to you. Thank you very much.